Sometimes people will go to the most ridiculous lengths just to stir up drama. That's exactly what happened when my neighbors, two entitled sisters who acted like they owned the entire street, decided to make my life miserable over something as silly as my Wi-Fi name. Yes, you read that right. These women actually tried to sue me because of the Wi-Fi name I chose for my own internet. At first I thought it was some kind of prank or maybe just their way of complaining again, but I was wrong. They were dead serious, and things escalated faster than I could imagine. They had already complained about where I parked, the noise from my lawnmower, even the color of my curtains. But this time they crossed the line. They claimed that my Wi-Fi name was offensive and personally targeted at them. The funny part, I had no idea they could even see it, let alone think it was directed at them. Still, they stormed up to my house one evening, demanding that I change it immediately. When I refused, they threatened to take it to court. I laughed, thinking there was no way anyone would waste time over something this absurd. But then I got the summons. They had actually filed a case. The day of the hearing arrived, and I walked into the courtroom prepared for anything. What happened next was beyond anything I could have expected. The judge, the jury, even the people sitting in the back couldn't believe what they were hearing. And when the truth came out, the entire courtroom burst into uncontrollable laughter. What started as their attempt to humiliate me ended up backfiring in the most spectacular way possible. Asterisk. It was one of those quiet Saturday mornings where everything feels calm. The sun filtered through the blinds. Birds were chirping outside. And for the first time in a while I felt like I had a chance to relax. I had brewed a cup of coffee, sat down with my laptop, and was about to do some online shopping. But then my computer reminded me that my Wi-Fi router still had the default network name, one of those boring manufacturer codes with random numbers and letters. I leaned back in my chair and thought, why not change it to something fun? Most people I knew had creative names for their Wi-Fi networks. My cousin had called his Pretty Fly for a Wi-Fi. My coworker had named hers Hide Your Kids, Hide Your Wi-Fi. Some were practical, some were funny, but all of them were better than the bland code I currently had. So I opened up the router settings and typed in the first thing that came to my mind. Not your Wi-Fi. I laughed to myself as I hit save. It wasn't clever, it wasn't insulting, it wasn't personal, it was just silly. It made me smile, and that was enough. Within minutes, my devices reconnected, and the new name appeared at the top of the Wi-Fi list. A tiny change, but it felt oddly satisfying, like personalizing a phone wallpaper or customizing a ringtone. What I didn't know was that this decision would set off a chain of events that spiraled into one of the most absurd conflicts I had ever experienced. A few hours later, as I was relaxing on the couch, there was a sharp knock at my door. Not just a casual knock, but the kind of aggressive pounding that makes you jump up immediately. I opened it to find the two sisters from next door, my neighbors, who had already earned a reputation in the street as busybodies. Their names were Sandra and Linda, though most people in the neighborhood quietly referred to them as the Karens. Sandra, the older one, stood with her arms crossed, glaring at me like I had just committed a crime. Linda, shorter and always echoing whatever her sister said, hovered slightly behind, looking equally offended. "Do you think this is funny?" Sandra barked before I could even say hello. "Excuse me," I asked, genuinely confused. "That Wi-Fi name, not your Wi-Fi that is clearly directed at us," she snapped, pointing her finger like she was delivering evidence in a courtroom. I blinked at her, trying to process the complaint. "Wait, you're upset about my Wi-Fi name?" Linda piped up. "It's hostile. It's like you're mocking us. Everyone in the neighborhood can see it. How dare you?" I had to bite my lip to stop myself from laughing. They were dead serious, standing on my porch as if I had vandalized their property. "It's just a Wi-Fi name," I explained calmly. "It's not about you or anyone, really. It's just supposed to be funny." "Don't play dumb," Sandra shot back. "We know it's about us. You've always had an attitude. First, you park too close to our driveway. Then you mow the lawn too early. And now this. It's harassment." "Harassment? For naming my own Wi-Fi," I said, stunned. "Come on, you can't be serious." "Oh, we're very serious," Sandra hissed. "You're going to change it." Right now I shook my head slowly. "Sorry, but no, it's my Wi-Fi. I can name it whatever I want. If you don't like it, just don't connect to it, which you shouldn't be doing anyway." That set them off like firecrackers. Both sisters started shouting over each other about disrespect, neighborhood standards, and how I was causing emotional distress. I stood there, holding the doorframe, half amused and half exhausted. After several minutes of ranting, they finally stormed off with Sandra shouting over her shoulder, "Fine, if you won't change it, we'll see you in court." I laughed out loud as the door shut behind them. Surely, they were bluffing. Who in their right mind would take legal action over something so ridiculous? It was absurd. I didn't think about it again for the rest of the day. But later that evening, I noticed them in their yard, whispering furiously to each other while glaring at my house. They were on the phone at different times, probably complaining to anyone who would listen. I shrugged it off, figuring they were just venting. Days passed, and every time I saw them, they shot me dirty looks. Once while I was taking out the trash, Sandra muttered loudly enough for me to hear, Some people just don't belong in this neighborhood. Linda nodded in agreement, clutching her phone like she was documenting my every move. I ignored them, but something told me they weren't letting this go. Then, about 2 weeks later, I came home from work to find an official-looking envelope stuck in my doorframe. I opened it and froze. It was a court summons. My jaw dropped. The sisters had actually filed a lawsuit against me. They were suing me for emotional distress and intentional targeting through the hostile and abusive labeling of an internet network. I read it 3 times, thinking maybe it was a joke or some kind of prank letter, but no, it was real. Their names were right there as plaintiffs, and I was the defendant. I sank onto my couch, holding the papers in disbelief. They're actually serious, I muttered. Part of me wanted to laugh, but another part of me was nervous. I had never been sued before, and even though the case was ridiculous, the thought of standing in court made me uneasy. Still, I couldn't help but marvel at the absurdity of it all. Out of all the possible neighborhood disputes, fences, trees, noise, property lines, they chose to go to war over a Wi-Fi name. That night, I poured myself another cup of coffee, stared at the router, and whispered, "Not your Wi-Fi. You better be worth it," because apparently, this was just the beginning. I couldn't sleep the night I received that summons. It wasn't fear of losing. Not really. I knew deep down there was no way a judge would actually rule against me for naming my own Wi-Fi network. But the idea that I had to show up in court over something this ridiculous gnawed at me. My mind kept replaying the scene of the sisters marching up to my door, screaming about harassment, and then triumphantly storming off. Now they were probably patting themselves on the back, thinking they had me cornered by morning. I had convinced myself it was all some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe the paperwork was wrong. Maybe it would all be thrown out before it went anywhere. But when I read it again in the clear light of day, I realized it was very real. A court date, a case number, and a claim of emotional distress caused by hostile digital communication. Digital communication. My Wi-Fi name wasn't even a message, it was just text floating in the air. I decided to talk to a lawyer, just to be safe. A friend recommended a local guy who handled small civil disputes. His office was tiny, cluttered with papers and old coffee cups, but he had this calm demeanor that immediately made me feel better. I slid the summons across his desk, expecting at least a smirk, maybe even outright laughter, but he didn't crack a smile, at least not right away. He scanned the document carefully, nodding slowly, and then finally looked up. "This," he said, tapping the paper with his pen, "is one of the most ridiculous cases I've seen in years." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "So I'm not crazy." "Oh, you're fine. They're the crazy ones," he said. "But unfortunately, you still have to show up and defend yourself. The court won't just ignore it because it's silly." "Great," I muttered. "So what do I do?" He leaned back in his chair. "You show up, tell the truth, and let them make fools of themselves. Honestly, the judge will probably dismiss it within minutes. But if you want, I can represent you." I thought about the cost and shook my head. "No, I think I can handle it. I mean, it's just Wi-Fi." "Suit yourself," he said with a shrug, though I could tell he wanted to be there for the entertainment. For the next week, the sisters seemed to revel in their newfound sense of power. Every time I left my house, they were outside, whispering and smirking like villains in a cheap drama. Once, as I was backing out of my driveway, Sandra called out, "Better get ready for court." Linda chimed in, "Justice is coming." They giggled like schoolgirls who thought they'd pulled off the ultimate prank. I ignored them, though inside I was boiling. It wasn't just the absurdity of the case, it was the smugness. They genuinely believed they had me trapped. As the court date grew closer, I started noticing how word had spread around the neighborhood. At first it was subtle neighbors giving me curious glances, then looking quickly away. A few days later, people started asking questions. "Hey, is it true you're being sued over your Wi-Fi name?" they'd say, struggling not to laugh. I would nod and explain the story, and without fail, they would burst out laughing halfway through. One neighbor, an older man named Mr. Thompson, chuckled so hard he had to wipe tears from his eyes. "I've lived here 40 years, he said, wheezing, "and I've seen arguments about fences, barking dogs, even a tree branch that grew 6 inches into someone else's yard. But this takes the cake." Even people I barely knew were stopping me to ask about it. It became the neighborhood's favorite joke, though the sisters clearly didn't see it that way. They walked around with their heads high, pretending they were the heroes who were finally putting me in my place. I started wondering if maybe they had convinced themselves that the case was real, that they'd actually win. Finally, the morning of the hearing arrived. I woke up early, dressed in clean clothes that weren't too formal but still respectful, and drove to the courthouse with a mixture of nerves and amusement swirling in my stomach. As I parked and walked inside, I reminded myself it's just Wi-Fi, don't overthink it. But the sisters were already there, waiting in the hallway. They spotted me immediately and swooped over like hawks. Sandra was wearing a stiff navy blue blazer that looked like it had been pulled out of the back of a closet, while Linda clutched a stack of papers as if she were carrying evidence for a murder trial. "You're going down today," Sandra sneered. "We have everything we need." "Everything you need for what?" "A comedy routine," I asked dryly. Linda gasped. clutching her papers closer. Mocking us won't help you in front of the judge. I rolled my eyes and walked past them, finding a seat in the waiting area. Other people were there too, real cases, people with serious problems, yet here I was, stuck in the middle of it all because of two women who thought a Wi-Fi name was a personal attack. I couldn't help but wonder what the judge would think. Would they laugh? Would they scold the sisters for wasting time? Would they get annoyed at all of us for bringing nonsense into their courtroom? The longer I waited, the more surreal it felt. My phone buzzed with a text from a friend. Good luck today. Make sure your Wi-Fi is turned off before court. Lol. I couldn't resist smiling. At least other people saw the humor in it. Finally, the clerk called our case. My heart thumped as I stood and walked into the courtroom. It was bigger than I expected, with tall ceilings, wooden benches, and that intimidating silence that makes you aware of every sound. The sisters strutted to their side like they were prosecutors in a high-profile trial, while I quietly took my seat at the defendant's table. The judge entered, a stern-looking woman with glasses who scanned the room before sitting down. Case number 2789, Sanders versus Miller, she said briskly. Claim of emotional distress. Plaintiffs, you may begin. Sandra rose dramatically, smoothing her blazer. Your Honor, she began, her voice quivering with righteous indignation. We have endured weeks of targeted harassment from our neighbor. He deliberately renamed his Wi-Fi network to attack us, using the phrase "not your Wi-Fi" to humiliate us publicly. We have suffered emotional turmoil, sleepless nights, and ridicule from others who saw this name. This was an intentional act of cruelty. Linda nodded furiously beside her, holding up the papers as if they contained smoking gun evidence. The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly, and she glanced down at the case file. I watched closely, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something shift. The corners of her mouth twitched ever so slightly like she was fighting back a laugh. And in that moment, I knew this case was about to take a turn neither sister expected. The air inside the courtroom felt heavier than it should have. Maybe it was the polished wood, the echo of footsteps, or the quiet anticipation of the small crowd seated in the benches behind us. But to me, it was the sheer absurdity of the situation. Here I was, defending myself against two neighbors who had decided my Wi-Fi name was worthy of a lawsuit. The judge looked down at the papers the sisters had filed, then back up at them. So your complaint is based on the defendant's Wi-Fi network name? She asked, her tone neutral but edged with disbelief. Yes, Your Honor, Sandra said firmly. It was a deliberate attempt to insult us. Linda, clutching her so-called evidence, added, we have screenshots, Your Honor, multiple screenshots. She fumbled with the papers and handed them to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. The judge adjusted her glasses and studied the screenshots, pictures of a phone screen displaying the network list, with "not your Wi-Fi" circled in red marker. After a long pause, she set them down and looked at me. Defendant, is this your Wi-Fi network? Yes, Your Honor, I said, keeping my voice steady. That's the name I gave it. And why did you choose that name? I shrugged slightly. Honestly, just for fun. It wasn't directed at anyone. I've used other silly names in the past like Pretty Fly for a Wi-Fi and Land of the Free. I never thought anyone would take it personally. A muffled laugh came from somewhere in the back of the room. The judge shot a sharp glance toward the benches, and the sound stopped immediately. But I could see shoulders shaking, people trying to hold it in. Sandra leaned forward. Your Honor, don't you see? He's mocking us. Not your Wi-Fi is clearly telling us we're not welcome. It's an attack. The judge tilted her head. Is your neighbor preventing you from accessing your own Wi-Fi service? Well, no, Sandra faltered. Has he attempted to interfere with your internet in any way? Not exactly. But then how? The judge said, her patience thinning. Does the name of his personal Wi-Fi network constitute harassment? Linda jumped in. Because everyone can see it. The entire neighborhood sees it. People laugh at us because they know it's aimed at us. The judge pinched the bridge of her nose. Do you have any evidence that the name was specifically directed at you? There was silence. The sisters exchanged nervous glances. Then Sandra straightened her shoulders. Your Honor, it's obvious. We've had problems with him before. He parks too close to our driveway. He mows his lawn too early in the morning. And he deliberately waves at us in a sarcastic way. This is part of a pattern. That did it. A ripple of laughter broke out across the courtroom. People tried to smother it behind their hands, but the absurdity was too much. Even I had to bite my tongue to keep from grinning too broadly. The judge rapped her gavel. Order, I will have order, she said sternly, though I swore I saw her lips twitching at the corners. She turned to me again. Do you wish to respond to these allegations? Yes, Your Honor, I said. First, I've never mocked them. I park where I'm legally allowed. I mow my lawn during the day, not at night. And as for waving, well, I think that's called being neighborly. A few more chuckles escaped from the benches. The Wi-Fi name was never about them. It's just a silly phrase. If I wanted to target them, I'd have named it something like Karen's Nightmare. But I didn't. It was never about them. That line set off another wave of stifled laughter. Someone coughed loudly to cover it, but the sound only made it worse. The judge raised an eyebrow at the sisters. Plaintiffs, do you have anything else to add? Sandra's face was turning red, whether from anger or embarrassment I couldn't tell. Your Honor, we demand justice. This man is humiliating us publicly. The judge sighed, leaning back in her chair. Justice, she repeated, over a Wi-Fi name. She tapped her pen on the desk, thinking for a long moment. Then she looked at the sisters squarely. Ladies, I'm going to be frank. The court is not here to settle petty squabbles between neighbors. A Wi-Fi name, unless explicitly threatening, does not constitute harassment or emotional distress. What you have brought here is not a case of lot, it is a case of personal annoyance. And frankly, it is wasting the court's time. Boom. That was the moment. The words hit the room like a spark in dry grass. The benches erupted in laughter, louder this time, no longer held back. Even the bailiff cracked a grin. People shook their heads, some doubled over, others clapping their hands against their knees in disbelief. The judge banged her gavel again, but this time even she was smiling. Order, please, let me finish. Sandra and Linda sat frozen, their mouths open, faces redder than fire trucks. They looked like children being scolded in front of the entire school. The judge continued, her tone now firm but tinged with amusement. The court dismisses this case immediately. No damages, no further hearings. Plaintiffs are advised not to misuse legal resources for personal grievances of this nature again. Case closed. She slammed the gavel down one final time. The room erupted again, laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Some people actually clapped. I couldn't stop smiling as I stood to leave. I had walked in with nerves, unsure of how this ridiculous day would end. And I was walking out the victor not because I had won some great legal battle, but because the truth had been so painfully obvious that even the judge couldn't keep a straight face. That I walked past the sisters. Sandra hissed, "This isn't over." "I think it is," I replied calmly. Still smiling, completely over, they stormed out of the courtroom, shoulders hunched, refusing to meet the eyes of the people laughing around them. When I stepped outside into the sunlight, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. A couple of people from the benches even approached me, still chuckling. "Man, that was priceless," one of them said. "I'll be telling that story for years." I nodded, laughing myself. All over a Wi-Fi name. As I drove home, I thought about the whole ordeal. They had tried to make me a joke, but in the end, they became the punchline. And the best part, my Wi-Fi still read "Not your Wi-Fi," proudly broadcasting to the neighborhood like a small digital trophy of the most ridiculous lawsuit I'd ever heard of. And that was the day I learned that sometimes, the best way to win is simply to let people expose their own foolishness. News traveled fast in our little neighborhood. By the time I pulled into my driveway after the hearing, it felt like the whole block already knew what had happened. A few neighbors who had clearly been waiting for me outside smiled knowingly as I parked. One of them, Mrs. Patel from across the street, gave me a little wave and mouthed, "Well done." I grinned back, shaking my head in disbelief. I had walked into court thinking I might face an uphill battle defending something as silly as a Wi-Fi name. Instead, I'd walked out with the judge practically laughing at the absurdity of the case. And now, the sisters who had tried so hard to humiliate me were the ones being laughed at. Over the next few days, the fallout became very clear. People couldn't stop talking about it. At the local grocery store, I overheard two women by the produce section chuckling. "Did you hear about Sandra and Linda suing over a Wi-Fi name? Can you imagine?" One said. The other laughed. "Honestly, I'm embarrassed for them. What a waste of time." At the coffee shop, I caught the barista whispering the story to a customer, mimicking a dramatic courtroom voice. "Your Honor," he named it "Not your Wi-Fi" as a direct attack. Everyone within earshot burst out laughing. For once, I wasn't the one under the microscope. The sisters, who had spent years nitpicking everyone else's behavior, had finally overplayed their hand. They weren't feared anymore, they were ridiculed at first. They tried to carry themselves with the same inflated pride they'd always had. I saw them walking down the street a couple of days after court, chins lifted high, pretending nothing had happened. But it was impossible to ignore the smirks and whispers that followed them. People who had once tolerated their bossiness now avoided eye contact or, worse, giggled openly when they passed. The real shift came at the next neighborhood association meeting. Normally, Sandra would dominate the room, raising endless complaints on too long, kids too loud, trash cans out too early. But this time, when she tried to bring up some minor issue about recycling bins, the room practically buzzed with suppressed laughter. Someone in the back even muttered, "Careful, she might sue the bins." The whole room cracked up. Sandra's face turned crimson, and she abruptly sat down. Seething from that night on, their authority in the neighborhood vanished. Nobody took them seriously anymore. Meanwhile, I enjoyed a newfound kind of respect. Neighbors who barely acknowledged me before started stopping by to chat. "Hey," they'd say with a grin, "you're the Wi-Fi guy, right?" They'd share their own funny Wi-Fi names with me. Wu-Tang Lan, get your own net, router. I hardly knew her. It became a running joke, and I was in on it instead of being the target. One evening, Mr. Thompson from 2 houses down invited me over for a beer. As we sat on his porch, he chuckled and said, "Son, you've done what no one else could, taken the Karens down a peg." I laughed. All I did was name my Wi-Fi. Exactly, he said. You didn't fight dirty. You didn't start a war. You just let them bury themselves in their own nonsense. And now the whole neighborhood sees them for who they are. He was right. I hadn't planned any of it, but the result was better than anything I could have imagined, of course. The sisters didn't take their humiliation quietly. For weeks after the case was dismissed, they doubled down on glaring at me whenever I passed. Once, as I was mowing the lawn, Sandra stood at the edge of her driveway with her arms crossed, shaking her head dramatically like she was disapproving of a teenager sneaking home past curfew. Another time, Linda yelled from her porch, "Enjoy your little victory. Karma always comes back." But their words didn't have the bite they used to. Before, their constant complaints made me tense. Now, they just made me laugh. Even my friends teased me about it. "Careful," one joked. "Don't sneeze too loud near their house or you'll be back in court." The funniest part came about a month later, when I noticed a new Wi-Fi network pop up on my list. Its name, "We Will Sue Again." I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my phone. It had to be them. It was too perfect, too bitter, but the name only made them look sillier. I even considered renaming mine again to something like Sue This Too, but I decided against it. At that point, they didn't need any more help embarrassing themselves. Instead, I left mine as Not Your Wi-Fi. It had become more than just a name. It was a symbol of the whole ridiculous ordeal. Friends who visited my house would see it pop up on their phones and immediately start laughing. "This is the Wi-Fi," they'd ask, and I'd nod proudly. One Saturday afternoon, I was grilling in the backyard when a couple of neighbors wandered over, drawn by the smell of burgers. We sat around, eating and laughing, and naturally the Wi-Fi story came up again. Someone suggested I sell t-shirts that said "Not Your Wi-Fi Court Tested." We laughed so hard that my stomach hurt. Meanwhile, the sisters stayed mostly inside, avoiding long conversations with anyone. When they did come out, they kept to themselves. Their reign as self-appointed neighborhood watchdogs was over, replaced by the memory of their courtroom humiliation. Looking back, I realized something important. Before all this, I often felt powerless against their constant complaining. It was exhausting dealing with their negativity. But in trying to make me a villain, they had exposed themselves instead. All I had to do was stay calm, tell the truth, and let them unravel. By the end of that summer, the neighborhood had changed. People were friendlier, more willing to joke, less afraid of being picked apart. And every time I opened my laptop and saw those three little words, "Not Your Wi-Fi," I couldn't help but smile. It reminded me that sometimes, life doesn't need grand battles or clever comebacks to put bullies in their place. Sometimes all it takes is a little patience, a touch of humor, and the good sense to let people dig their own hole. And for Sandra and Linda, that hole was deep. The trial had ended weeks ago, but the laughter from that courtroom still echoed in my memory like a favorite song. I could see it so clearly, the judge trying to maintain composure, the jurors hiding their chuckles, and the gallery breaking into full-blown laughter when the sisters made their final, doomed plea. Every time I replayed it in my head, I couldn't help but smile. I never thought something as small as a Wi-Fi name could lead me into a courtroom, let alone create a memory that would stick with so many people. Life on our street settled into a different rhythm after the case was dismissed. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the invisible weight of the sisters' constant complaints. Before, every time I mowed the lawn, parked my car, or even watered my plants, I expected a glare from their porch. Now, those glares were still there, but they had lost their power. The sisters had become symbols of pettiness rather than authority. Where neighbors once avoided them, they now avoided embarrassment. It was as if the courtroom itself had stripped away their influence. I began noticing little changes in the neighborhood. People smiled more. They waved to one another more often. At block gatherings, the Wi-Fi story always came up, and laughter always followed. In a strange way, my silly network name had given everyone a shared inside joke. One neighbor renamed theirs "Not Your Problem." Another popped up as "Courtroom Drama." Even old Mr. Thompson, who had never touched his router before, asked his grandson to rename his Wi-Fi case "Dismissed." The whole thing had become a badge of humor and solidarity. The sisters, however, didn't take it so lightly. They rarely came outside anymore except for short walks to the mailbox, where they hurried back indoors after catching whispers and stifled laughter from the neighbors. One afternoon, as I was raking leaves, I noticed them peeking through their blinds like characters from a comedy sketch. It would have been almost sad if it hadn't been so ridiculous. They had tried to humiliate me, but in the end, they had humiliated themselves. Still, I made no effort to rub it in. Victory didn't need me to gloat. It was already written on the faces of everyone else. The sisters had been dethroned, not by anger or confrontation, but by their own absurdity. That realization gave me a strange kind of peace. For years, I'd thought of them as bullies, but now, I just saw them as people who had let their pettiness consume them. As winter approached, the story traveled even further. A coworker forwarded me a meme someone had made online about neighbors suing over Wi-Fi names. My friends tagged me in it, laughing, asking if I was the guy. Of course, I admitted it was me. Why deny it? The truth was funnier than any joke. One night, while sitting at my desk with a mug of coffee, I thought about renaming my Wi-Fi once again something final like Courtroom or Laughingstock, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Not Your Wi-Fi had already become legendary. It didn't need to change. That name had endured the storm, made it into a courtroom, and outlived the sisters' wildest attempts to destroy it. It had become more than a joke. It was a symbol of resilience. Looking out my window at the quiet street, I realized something else. The case had taught me more than I'd expected. It reminded me that not every battle requires shouting or fighting. Sometimes, all you need is patience and truth. Letting people expose their own ridiculousness is far more powerful than stooping to their level. And when laughter does the rest of the work for you, well, that's just the universe adding a punchline. By spring, the sisters had faded into the background. The neighborhood had moved on, and so had I. The tension was gone, replaced by an easy kind of freedom I hadn't felt in years. My Wi-Fi still blinked from its little router, strong and steady. Not your Wi-Fi. It remained exactly as it always had, simple, funny, untouchable. A three-word monument to the idea that sometimes the smallest things lead to the biggest lessons. In the end, I didn't just win a case. I won back my peace of mind, my neighborhood's spirit, and a story that would be told for years. The sisters may never laugh about it, but the rest of us would, and that was enough.